I thank my colleague, and I recognize Mr. Marshall from Kansas for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question for Ms. Van Cleave. Ms. Van Cleave, I'm a freshman congressman, and one of my jobs is trying to prioritize and figure out how big problems are. There's plenty of problems for us to solve. Our trade deficit was a $575 billion problem. I've been told that this intellectual theft may be worth $500 billion, $1 trillion. Can you kind of put a number to it, or just a wild guess on how much is this impacting our country every year?
So the Intellectual Property Commission, headed up by Admiral Blair and Ambassador Huntsman, first met in 2013 and issued a landmark report. They updated it just last year, and their estimate is $510 billion, roughly, in intellectual property theft last year. And
all that could basically buy down our trade deficit. That's amazing. I think I'll go to Mr. Wessel next. Mr. Lipinski talked about using a scalpel. I would talk about using a laser. If you were to focus on the companies that are the bad actors, the cheaters, the people that are basically robbing our banks, what are we doing now to punish them? What could we do? Why aren't we punishing these people that are trying to steal and stealing, the bigger companies? Is anything happening?
There are some things happening. It's, the problem, as identified by the Commission and many others, is ongoing, and there's no way to get your hands around it all the time. But the failure to have significant ongoing sanctions has sent a message that much of what goes on you can get away with. You may recall that President Xi and President Obama signed a memorandum of understanding on the use of cyber espionage for economic gain. The problem was that the Chinese don't view economic gain as, a separate inbox on the president's desk. Economic and national security are inextricably intertwined. So part of the problem is making sure we define the issue, we have coherent responses, and that there are real sanctions and costs for what happened. I mentioned earlier about the indictments of the 5 PLA hackers for going into 5 U.S. companies, Westinghouse, a number of others. The indictment was sealed. There's been no follow-up action.
When you say sanctions, can we do sanctions just on companies rather than entire countries?
Yes, you can. I mean, we've had that situation, there was a tasking, meaning that certain companies asked the Chinese government for information or worked with them to get it. The information was obtained through 5 PLA hackers and transferred back to the companies. And then that was utilized. U.S. Steel filed a case at the ITC on this, trying to have a sanction that was ultimately ruled, the case was thrown out. There are ways of looking at what has been taken, what has been applied in the market, and sanctioning specific companies. There's also a broader problem that's going to need a more general solution to.
Give me an example of something that we as Americans would consider intellectual theft that the Chinese wouldn't, that it's okay. That you kind of mentioned something there. I didn't quite follow that.
No, after they signed the agreement, there was this view that China was going to limit its cyber incursions into the U.S., and the prohibition or the agreement was it was not going to affect economic issues. They wouldn't do it for economic gain. But China views their economic progress, their security, their growth rate as part of their national security. If they can't,
so their means justifies the ends. It's okay
Correct.
to cheat as long as it benefits
Correct.
their national security, so to speak.
Correct, and a different definition. They didn't view it as economic espionage. They viewed it as enhancing their national security.
Mr. Golden, what would you do to micro-focus, to laser in on the companies that are cheating?
Would the gentleman turn his mic on, please?
Okay.
So I focused my book's about espionage in academia and higher education.
So great. So people are espionaging intellectual property from universities. What would you do to punish them? What are we not doing? Why do we just turn our head and say it's okay?
Well, yes, that's a good question, Congressman. I can speak to that. You're right. There has been a number of examples where people have been caught spying, and the universities have not really punished them. For example, the case a few years ago of the Russian illegals in the U.S., the 10 Russian illegals, the case that gave rise to the show The Americans, 7 or 8 of them had been in U.S. universities, and one of them had gone to Columbia Business School, and evidence came out that her role there had been to recruit classmates and professors, and yet Columbia didn't revoke her degree when it came out that she wasn't Cynthia Murphy, she was Lydia Guryeeva, and she was working for Russia.
Okay. We're over my time. I'm sorry. I yield back the rest of my time. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I might interject, I need to correct the record of an answer I just gave a moment ago. The $510 billion figure, which I cited, in fact, is the amount that we annually invest in R&D, but consulting my records of the Huntsman-Blair Commission report, they had this to say last year. We estimate that at the low end, the annual cost to the U.S. economy of several categories of IP theft exceeds $225 billion, with the unknown cost of other types of IP theft almost certainly exceeding that amount and possibly as high as $600 million annually.
$600 billion?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
I thank my colleagues, and if our panelists will accommodate us, we'll have a